Hi, I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Driver 61's Circuit Guide for Donington Park's National Circuit. In this guide we're going to take a look at and examine real race footage reviewing braking points, racing lines and some local knowledge. Donington Park is a fast and flowing circuit with the national configuration consisting of 10 turns over 1.9 miles. It's a favourite amongst many drivers and in my opinion one of the best circuits in Europe. I have to admit I have a soft spot for this track as it's my home circuit and I also held the outright lap record here before layout changes in 2010. We're going to use some onboard footage from a race I competed in earlier in the year in a Radical sports car, which offers a great view of the circuit, and with the data logging system we run, you can also view throttle and brake positions, allowing a real insight inside the driving technique. So without further ado, let's begin by taking a look at the complete lap before we dive into more detail and break down each corner individually. So here we are on the start-finish straight of Donington Park, on board with myself in the Radical. Heading down to the first corner, Redgate, which requires heavy braking as it's one of the slowest corners on the circuit. Also has quite a late apex here. We're back on the gas, down the hill, through Hollywood, towards the very exciting Craner curves. This left hand is very difficult and very quick. Next up, it's the old Hairpin. Medium braking here, sending the car into the apex and accelerating back up a slight hill towards Schwantz Curve and McLeans. Schwantz Curve is flat out in many cars before quite heavy braking into McLeans. Again, a late apex before we head back up the hill towards one of the most important corners on the circuit, Coppice. Bringing the car into the apex and getting on the accelerator as soon as possible so we carry as much speed down the next straight as possible. Next up it's Goddards, which is a medium speed right-left chicane, heavy braking on the entry, flicking the car into the apex and into the left. Back on the gas as soon as we can so we carry as much speed down the start-finish straight. And that's one flying lap of Donington Park. So here we are on the approach to Redgate. It's the slowest corner at Donington Park and actually has an angle of more than 90 degrees. The approach down the start-finish straight is easy and flat, and the corner is actually quite important as there's a relatively long flat-out section after it. It requires heavy braking and downshift, and now we're going to take a quick look at braking references as we approach Redgate corner. So you can see we're coming down the start-finish straight here, heading towards the plus 90 degree corner. Now I always ask my drivers to look for braking references in heavy braking zones. So we're going to run through some examples here. Obviously it depends what car you're in, what speed you're approaching the corner at, and how quickly your car will decelerate. But it's important that you take a reference and you're conscious of that on each lap that you drive around Donington Park. So on the left hand side here you can see there are some great braking references. For example, you have the end of the pit wall here, and then there's an Armco barrier that runs a little bit further down, and you can also use the end of this. Not saying that you have to brake exactly on these points, but you could be braking 20 meters before or even 20 meters after. It's just a reference. If you're in a quicker or a lighter car even that will decelerate even more quickly, you can move down and begin to use the hatching on the pit lane exit here on the left hand side as a reference. So in the Radical, for example, we're braking just after the point of the triangle here. The entry of Redgate requires a late turn-in, so we maximise the speed that we can take out of the corner. This all comes from good vision, and even at this point on the circuit, we should already be looking well ahead of ourselves, looking for the apex. The further that you look ahead of yourself, the easier it will be to bring the car into the apex and get the perfect racing line. So at this point, our vision should already be across at the inside of the circuit here. Okay, we're not necessarily steering towards this point right now, but we're already looking across so we can manage the speeds, the braking position and the steering position and bring the car into that apex properly. As we come down here, you can see that we should be keeping the car over to the left hand side as much as possible. So we're opening up the corner as wide as we can so we can carry as much momentum and speed through there as possible. So we're keeping the car over to the left. You can see that I'm already beginning to steer, but the turning point is actually, if we move it back, here's the end of the pit lane on the left hand side. The turning point is just after that. But you'll notice that my steering gradually increases. We're not just turning the car in very hard, we're gradually loading the car up, almost running it around the outside for the first part of the corner before we gradually increase the steering lock, and you can see here I'm putting more and more steering angle into the car. The apex point at Redgate is easily marked by an exit road for emergency vehicles to get onto the circuit. So if we just move forwards here, you can see the exit road on the right hand side, just here. Where the farthest part of the tarmac runs, where it meets the curb at the racetrack, that's where the apex is. So we'll just move the car into the apex now, and you can see here is where we should be making the apex. You can actually see just after this point where all the grass has rubbed away, where some saloon cars have been running onto it. As we're coming into the apex here, your vision again should be well ahead of yourself, looking down at the apex and even further around the course, giving yourself as much time as possible to judge the speed and judge the racing line so you get the maximum speed through the corner and down the next straight. Bringing the car onto the curb here, as you can see I have. The curb on the inside at Redgate is very flat, so all cars can run over it, and you want to do that so you maximise the width of the corner and obviously carry that speed through it. A good exit out of Redgate is critical for lap time. The next corner is Hollywood and it's flat out, so it's very important that we carry as much speed through Redgate and out of it as possible. The idea is to get the car as straight as we can as early as possible and get on the gas so we carry the momentum through the next corner. As we're coming out of the corner, we should already be looking a long way forwards so we give ourselves as much time as possible to gauge when we can get on the accelerator. For example, we should be looking in this area here, looking through the corner, and we can see the exit point here, getting on the gas in correlation with how much road we have available to ourselves. So as we're coming out of the corner here, as I mentioned, the idea is to get on the throttle as soon as possible. We're opening up the steering and using as much road on the exit as possible. Now the exit curb here is nice and flat again, like the inside curb is, and many of the curbs are at Donington. So you want to be running all the way up to the outside edge here as you can. Okay, we're going to be using all the track that we have possible. Hollywood is really just an acceleration zone for the Craner curves. It's a flat out corner, so we're not really going to take too much time to look at it, and instead we're going to focus more on the entry to the Craners. So as you're coming out of Redgate here, we're heading into Hollywood. It's all about positioning for your endpoint 200 or 300 meters ahead of here so you can get the best line through the Craners. The car wants to be positioned in somewhere in the middle of the road here, as you can see, taking quite a wide line with our vision looking a long way ahead of ourselves. Now the idea is to keep a wider line at the top of Hollywood so that we're all the way over to the right hand side of the circuit and best set up for the Craners as we turn into the left. So we're bringing the car gently in, and still we're away from the inside, and now here you can see the apex of Hollywood. Just after this curve is where we want to be meeting the inside of the circuit. So the apex point is here, and again you can see that some saloon cars have run onto the grass where the apex point is, a real giveaway for finding that apex. The white line on the right hand side here goes straight. So this section here for maybe 10 meters, 15 meters, the white line goes exactly straight. Your car wants to be parallel with this white line. Again, at this point, your vision should be looking further down the track than where we are, somewhere over here on the left hand side, looking for the inside of the corner curves. The entry of the corner curves is very, very quick. In some cars with aero, it's flat out. Many saloon and GT cars, it's either a very, very slight brake or just a lift. Now, everything that you do on the entry to the corners needs to be very, very smooth. High speed means that you can't just stamp on the brakes. It will unsettle the car too much. So whatever you do here, be very, very gentle with the car and don't steer very hard and don't brake very hard. As we're all the way over to the right hand side as possible, we've got our vision looking forwards, as I previously mentioned. We're going to steer the car very gently into the apex, still looking a long way ahead of ourselves. You can see the cars gently moving across. Now the apex point at the corner curves may be a little bit later than you'd expect, because we don't want to run too wide on the exit, as it will affect the next corner, the old hairpin. We're gently bringing the car across to the left hand side here, and it is possible to use the curb on the left just a little bit. I haven't used it in this example because the Radical has so much grip that I don't need to. Now at this point, when we're on the apex of the craners, you need to be looking again a long way ahead of yourself so you can gauge the speed that you can carry through the exit. The corner following the craner curves is the old hairpin, which is a quick right-hander, and this restricts the exit of the craner curves. If you go too far over to the right hand side, it restricts the speed that you can carry through the old hairpin. So what we do is we let the car move out to about the middle of the road, as you can see here, gently letting the car push out, and you could actually move a little bit further over to the right than I am in this video. So then we can get the car back over to the left for the old hairpin. Another reason that you shouldn't run too wide at this point is that often offline the circuit will become dirty and actually become more slippery than it is online. So one, you'll be wider, and two, you'll have less grip. So important to keep the car somewhere around the middle of the road here. In terms of vision, again, you should be looking a long way ahead of yourself, somewhere down here towards the braking zone and the turning point for the old hairpin. The old hairpin is one of my favourite corners at Donington Park. It's quite important as you need to carry a lot of speed through the apex into the exit towards Schwant's Curve and McLeans. As you can see here, we're coming off the craner curves down towards the old hairpin. We're somewhere in the middle of the road and we're driving straight diagonally across the circuit. So we're heading in this direction, across here towards the end of the curb. It's important that when you're braking, the steering wheel is straight, as you can see here. So you're braking in a nice straight line. Any steering angle here will unsettle the car. And we're turning the car in quite early, just before the end of the curb on the left here. Now it's important that you don't focus on the curb on the left, because you should already be looking at the apex. So even as we're back here, your vision should be across, looking for the apex of the old hairpin all the way down here. We're letting the car push across to the left hand side of the circuit with our vision down at the apex, as I mentioned, gently turning the steering wheel in towards the inside of the corner. So as you can see, we're bringing the car into the apex here at the old hairpin towards the inside of the circuit. As I turn the car in, you can see I've got a tiny bit of oversteer, steering wheel straight while the car's turning, got a little bit of rotation in the car, which is fine. Bringing the car in to the curb, and here is the apex, right on the inside, using as much curb as possible. Just note, for those of you who are racing, it's illegal to run beyond this part of the curb. Now from this camera angle, it looks like I have just run onto the green curb slightly, but it's not really that much of a problem in this situation. At this point, we should be looking a long way ahead of ourselves again, looking towards the exit of the old hairpin in this region here, looking for the exit curb so we can gauge when we can get on the accelerator. Towards the exit of the old hairpin, we should be looking, as always, a long way ahead of ourselves, letting the car push out, and the curb at this point on the left hand side here actually is a long way away from the car, but because of the track design it comes back in quite sharply, so we don't make this first part of the curb. In fact, if you're running on this early part of the exit curb, you'll run onto the grass afterwards. So we're actually making the curb quite a long way along itself, using as much road on the left hand side as possible. And again, you can see here that the maximum amount of road that we can legally use is up to the left hand side of the curb. Beyond this, there is a thin strip of concrete and then some grass crating beyond this. So if you do make a slight mistake, you can run over this area. It isn't too dangerous as long as you're very smooth with the car. Once we've exited the old hairpin, we move the car back over to the right hand side gently. Now we don't need to go all the way to the right hand side, as the next left isn't really that much of a corner. It's flat out in most cars. Bringing the car over to the left hand side here, and we're just trying to make the car be as free as possible, so we accelerate slightly uphill as quickly as we can. Now you can use this curb on the left hand side. It's very flat and very easy to use, but it's not necessary in this Radical. Then we're just opening up the steering wheel and letting the car push out wide towards the exit curb here. Again, we should be looking a long way ahead of ourselves, somewhere in the region of up here into Schwant's curve, so that we can gauge our speed and our line into the next corner. Next up we have Schwant's and McLeans. Now Schwant's is used only really as a braking area for McLeans, so we try to straight line Schwant's as much as possible before we get on the brakes. It's important that as you're coming into Schwant's, you keep the car as far to the right as possible and resist the urge to turn in too early. A common mistake here at Schwant's is to turn in too early and then the car pushes too far to the right hand side on the exit, making McLeans very, very difficult. So we're keeping the car on the curb on the right hand side and just releasing it from the curb maybe 10 to 15 meters before the end of it. Again, obviously you shouldn't be staring in this area here. You should be already looking around the corner in front of you. So we should be looking towards the inside here and the curb on the inside. Steering the car very gently into Schwant's, and we can use all of the curb on the left hand side here. It's flat as all of the curbs are at Donington, so it's possible to run right over it. As you can see, I've run right up to the edge of the curb here, and I'm going to get the car in a straight line as soon as possible for the heavy braking at McLeans. Now, we don't follow the left hand side white line of the circuit here. We actually drive towards the centre or the left hand quarter of the circuit, so we should be driving directly across here. If you move the car too far to the left, it means that you actually have to steer while you're braking, and also it's very difficult to bring the car then into the apex at McLeans. So heavy braking here towards McLeans. In many cars it's a gear change or two down. Slowing the car down, and at this point we should already be looking towards the apex point on the inside, so already looking well ahead of ourselves. It's very difficult at McLeans to have a reference for a turning point, so you really need to do it off feel, and that just comes with experience and seat time in the car around Donington Park. Once we've turned into McLeans, it's important not to get drawn in too early by the curb. The way it looks from this position, it looks like you should be actually making the apex right about here. However, after this point, the curb kinks out again, and this is actually the real apex. As you can see, as we move the car into the corner, we miss that first part of the curb and we make the second part. The apex is just here. So I've actually missed it slightly on this lap. My car should be another 40 or 50 centimeters over to the right hand side. Again, here at McLeans, you can use as much curb on the inside as you like, as it's flat and very easy to use. At this point, we should already be looking towards the exit and looking for the exit curb all the way out here. So make sure you keep your vision up and looking 200 metres or so ahead of yourself. The exit of McLeans has a slight yump in the surface of the circuit. So as you're coming over it and increasing the acceleration, just be careful that the rear doesn't come around, as the physics of the car and the circuit will naturally make it do this. So the yump is just about in this area here. So you'll naturally get a kick of oversteer at this point. As we're coming out and feeding the throttle in, again you need to use as much of the circuit as possible. We can use all of the blue and white curb on the left hand side, again very smooth and very easy to run over. As you can see here, there's a large strip of green concrete on the outside and then some dirt beyond that. After a short straight from McLeans corner, we're now heading up to Coppice. Coppice is the most important corner in the whole of Donington Park, as it has the longest straight after it. The approach is uphill and the apex is blind, so it's very difficult to pick it out when you're travelling at speed. On the left hand side here, we have some good reference points for braking, namely the curb on the left hand side. For me, this is the best reference for braking. Now, as I mentioned with Redgate, you may be braking 20 metres before, or you may even be braking after it. But just use this as a reference, and then you can gauge whether you need to be a little bit earlier on the brakes or whether you can go even deeper into Coppice. The braking into Coppice is uphill, so this will aid the slowing down of your car, which means you can probably brake a little bit later than you usually would. So now you can see we're heading up towards Coppice and we can't see the apex. So this comes with experience and seat time at Donington. Very difficult to pick out this apex. We're keeping the car over to the left hand side, braking in a straight line. At this point we'll be easing off the brakes as we come over the brow. And you can see here I'm just turning in, just beginning to turn here, in here, as the apex comes into view, which is just about here. In terms of turning point references, just as we're coming to the end of the curb on the left hand side is the point at which we turn in. Again, don't focus on the outside curb here, you should be looking towards the inside of the circuit, but you can just use it as a reference in your peripheral vision. It's important that you make it to the apex of the corner at Coppice, because you really need to get on the accelerator as soon as possible to prepare yourself down the next straight. So bringing the car into the apex, and you can see it again, it's a typical curb for Donington Park, nice and flat, you can run right over it. Now, for 2015, they've put another curb on the inside of the blue and white curb. Legally, when you're racing, you're not allowed to run on this. I've run on it a couple of times just to see what it's like, and there's a big lump right at the beginning of the curb, so I would advise stay off the green curb, but use as much of the blue and white curb as possible. At this point, as you're making the apex for Coppice, you should already be looking right around here, looking for the exit point and beyond, so that you can get on the accelerator pedal as soon as possible to propel yourself down the next straight. To make a good lap time at Donington Park, it's absolutely critical to get a good exit coming out of Coppice. As you can see here, we're just leaving the apex. I've got a little bit of oversteer on this particular lap, but I'll be feeding the accelerator in. Now, we don't need to run out to this first curb on the left hand side. If you let the car run out too wide here, you just won't be able to bring it back in, and you'll run out of road and have to lift off the accelerator, just destroying the speed down the next straight. So we're running about 3/4 of the way across the circuit, and it's very important at this point to be looking all the way around here in this area, looking for the exit curbs. At this point we should already be feeding in the throttle. In the Radical, I'm flat out already. In many saloon and GT cars you'll have to be feathering the accelerator in. We're bringing it in, and now we're just letting the car push out and push out and push out. So at this point, where we're passing the curb on the right hand side, we should be somewhere in the middle of the road. Feeding in the throttle, or hopefully flat out already, and letting the car push out all the way to the exit curb, opening up the steering wheel so the car can run as freely as possible and carry as much speed down the back straight as we can. It's very difficult to find a braking reference for Goddards. Because of the layout of the circuit, everything's quite a long way away, and so it's difficult to see anything in your peripheral vision. Therefore, the first braking reference that I recommend is on the right hand side here, which is the start of the outside curbing for the chicane for the Grand Prix circuit. This can be used, but it's quite an early braking reference, so maybe you'll brake 10 or 20 meters after this point. As we come further down, and it's a little bit difficult to see in this video, but the building just finishes at about this point. This is one of the main references for braking at Donington Park. As you see it flash by in your peripheral vision, you have a really good reference for braking. By the time you're on the brakes, you should already be looking down at the first curb or the first apex in the chicane here. As you can see, we're looking all the way down here on the right hand side of the circuit to gauge how much speed and what racing line we're taking into the chicane. We're slowing the car down on the brakes heavily here, and then at this point we're beginning just to turn the car in. Now there's no real reference on the left hand side for a turning point, and anyway you should already be looking towards the inside of the corner rather than concentrating or focusing on the left hand side. It's important that you use as much road as possible at the apex of Goddards. So as we're bringing the car in here, you can see that there's a sausage curb just here. Now you obviously want to use as much of the blue and white curb as possible without running over the red sausage curb. Sausage curb is maybe 20 centimeters high and shaped like a sausage. So if you run over it, it could cause your car some damage and it really won't help your lap time. Going to bring the car in, and the apex point you can clearly see by all the rubber that's on the sausage curb and on the white and blue curb here. It's in the middle of the sausage curb basically, quite an easy apex to spot here at Goddards. As we exit the first part of Goddards, we don't want to run too far to the left because it will restrict our exit through the left-hander, and we don't want to keep the car too far to the right because if it is too far to the right you could have carried more speed through the first part of Goddards. So we're looking for somewhere in the middle of the road here, looking again well forwards of our current position at the apex point on the left hand side. As with the right hand part of Goddards, we don't want to take too much curb on the left hand side and run the risk of running over the red sausage curb on the left. The left hand part of Goddards is very, very important as it controls your speed as you exit and carry that momentum down the next straight. Ideally we want to be on the accelerator as soon as possible as we're exiting Goddards. So we're bringing the car in using the maximum amount of curb on the left hand side here before we get back on the gas and start to look towards the exit of Goddards. The exit of Goddards is quite tricky as you're literally thrown out of the chicane. Make sure your vision's looking a long way ahead of ourselves. We should already be looking well around this area here as we can feel ourselves being pushed out onto the exit curb. Move the car forward. It brings you out quite early. You can see we're just at the start of the curb here, and at this point there's quite a nasty bump. So if you're in a stiff car, or any car really, you should just be careful over this area. Once we've gone over the bump, we're letting the car run as wide as we possibly can. Now just be careful that you don't run over the curb and onto the grass. Unlike some of the other corners, there's no concrete on the right hand side of this curb. So if you do fall off it, you're directly onto the grass, which means that you may spin, and the inside pit wall isn't too far away. So we're bringing the car along the curb, gently bringing it off, and we've finally exited Goddards with hopefully massive amounts of speed down the start-finish straight. Thank you for watching Driver 61's circuit guide for Donington Park. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and be sure to check out our other resources and circuit guides. Thank you, and see you next time.